Okay, good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar on demystifying training zones. My name is Tim Cusick. I'm the WKO product or the TrainingPeaks WKO product leader. I'm also a master coach here at Velocious Endurance Coaching. And I'll be leading tonight's webinar. I'm just seeing more people join, so now I'm going to stall a little bit again. Sometimes there's a delay in Zoom. Sorry about that. So as we go through tonight's webinar, I want to make sure that you ask questions. One of the things I'm trying to do with the WKO webinar series out of our WKO group is reduce the content slightly, but increase the interaction in Q&A and really give you guys the ability to ask questions and get engaged as you see fit. So please feel free to ask questions as we go. Do not use the chat button. I should put a red X through that. Please use the Q&A button. I can't monitor both at the same time in Zoom. Okay, it looks like we have a fair amount of people, so everybody must be on. Okay, here we go. Starting out tonight's webinar, one thing I want to be clear on is this is my opinion. As most of you know who follow my webinar series in different formats, is I try to give you an opinion so you can form your own. I'm absolutely not saying coach like me, but I find that in the educational process, kind of talk about the science, the physiology, and the process, but then show how I form that into a process. And I'm going to give you a couple of things that are really unique to me, meaning not unique maybe to the world, maybe others do it, but are unique to my process and opinion. So just make sure we know that going into tonight. So let's just simply start off with the most basic thing. What is a training zone? You guys want to go through an interesting exercise, right? Go on Google and after this webinar, or if you get too bored with the webinar, and search what is a training zone. And you'll get definitions like zone 1 is really easy and you can breathe and do all these things, right? And you'll get some general discussion, but you really cannot find a clear definition of what a training zone is. That's because it's one of those things that kind of people can identify. They sort of just know what it is, but asked to articulate it, it's not so easy. The reality is a training zone really is just a scheme of application and communication of the training intensity manipulation. If you watch my 3-part series on building annual plans and the different phases in a plan, I talked a lot about intensity manipulation as the core of what we do as we build a training plan. Well, training zones are a simple scheme that we can apply that and communicate it to athletes or others, in a articulate and a common language based way. If you look at the history of why these things came about, we have to go really back, way back to when intervals started. Intervals really started in the early 1900s as we began to really figure out that different training intensities led to different results. Back then we had kind of stopwatches or distance, right? You had 100 yards, you had a field, you had, I don't know, this stone to that stone, right? And you could go harder or easier and figure it out. But that's been a constant throughout as, distance evolved into stopwatch, evolved into heart rate monitor, into power, into all the metrics and the information that we have now, oxygen saturation and ventilatory rates and things like that. They still are a system of setting workout intensities. It still is a system that tracks workout compliance, right? That's all part of the history of it. In the sense that, if way back when intervals started, like if you go back to some of the early, like heavily used intervals by some, by coaches, they would do like areas. They'd mark off 300 meters or 300 yards or 100 yards, and you would run those and just do multiple as hard as you can intervals, right? And the reality was if you could do 10 of them and you were as hard as you can, you would be in compliance. Of course, now we have systems of compliance which have reached incredible levels of precision. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And finally, in the history, we were looking at ways to really define our racing and our pace and race performance, right? That was a tempo. That whole race was tempo, where we're running at threshold or riding at threshold type of description. So let's go a little deeper, right? Why do we have training zones? Well, if you go back to the process of training, the way I lay it out, we have this diagnosis, ability of the rider, demand of the event. And then we manipulate volume and intensity. via a training modality as we manage freshness and fitness, and that's how we come to peak performance. Well, and the reality is when we start talking about training zones, it is the system and the language of this manipulation. And that reality is volume and intensity each play a role in your training. Volume, as I've shown or I've talked about, it really is the amount of work performed, and it is the depth. It determines how much you adapt. There is a real training reality. To more you train, the more you're going to adapt, the better fit, the faster you're going to get. Now, go from 2 hours a week training to 25 hours a week training. That's probably not going to work out for you. And I'm just saying that right now so nobody does suddenly jumps up in hours and hurts themselves. But in the end of the day, when you look at training over time, volume is a very big deal. It drives the depth of how much you adapt. But intensity, that's the quality of work. So if this is the amount of work, intensity is the quality, and it's a specific quality because the intensity of your workouts or your everyday rides or even your recovery rides, that defines the adaptation. So when you really start to think about training levels and training zones, they really came about because we could we had ability for the longest time, to look at volume. But as we learned about, there was some specific relationship between the intensity of our workouts and the intensity of our exercise, and then the specificity of the adaptation, we began to need targeting and language to define that intensity. And when this process evolved, it really dealt with two complementary but not the same demands of athletic performance. On one side, you have this physiological performance, meaning we began to figure out that different training intensities require different energy or were produced by different energy systems. And eventually we kind of figured out that there was a whole metabolic range physiologically happening within inside of us, that we made energy different when we were walking briskly versus sprinting very quickly, right? And that is where a lot of this started. We began to understand we needed to improve specific physiological performance aspects of the athlete. But as we got smarter about those mechanisms, the metabolic function happening underneath, we also realized that particularly in endurance sports, because in endurance sports, we don't have as much skill. Like think about like you versus LeBron James as a famous basketball player. In your sport, you're spending 98 to 99% of your time working on conditioning and 1 to 2% working on skills. LeBron is working on 40% of his time on conditioning and 60% on skills. I mean, I don't know. LeBron and I aren't hanging out these days, but just making a point. So the reality is we in cycling have a higher demand of specific exercise intensity than most sports. And the reality is, as we began to understand the physiological side, we realized that we actually needed more specificity in the training because even beyond physiology, we needed to improve the athlete's ability to meet the specific demands of event performance. And an example is the Tour de France has dramatically different demands physiologically than Paris-Roubaix. Now, there's an underlying reality, right? You need a good aerobic athlete. You need, there's going to be certain commonalities that are complementary to each other, but there's a specificity that goes beyond that, which you need to address, and training levels were part of. So in reality, when we talk about the underlying physiology, you're really talking about three metabolic systems, right? Your aerobic, anaerobic glycolysis, phosphagen. There's lots of ways to look at this, but you have three basic systems, which really you could call this one aerobic, and you could lump these two into anaerobic if you wanted to oversimplify. And when it comes to performance specificity, we have the SAID principle. The SAID principle dominates a lot of our, or should dominate a lot of our exercise targeting and how we perform. And that's simply specific adaptation to imposed demands. You want to get better at riding a bike, you need to spend a lot of time on the bike. You want to get better at climbing a 10-minute hill, you need to spend a lot of time climbing a 10-minute hill. I mean, there's some ways you can kind of work around that, but I think you get the point, right? You need that specificity. So when we think about training zones, training levels, right? It was the combination of these two things which really drove the process. Why? They serve a purpose. And I broke that purpose into two things, right? First, training zones help define the purposeful intersection between time and intensity of training, how hard and how long. And I'm going to get into that clearly. But also understanding, and seems like overly simplified, but it really is important. Each zone also results in a different outcome for race fitness and physiological adaptations. Meaning, if you spend a tremendous amount of time in zone 2, you're going to adapt very well to be good at that zone, right? In that area. Spend a lot of time at zone 5, you're going to adapt really well with that area. Now, don't get me wrong, do it every day, you're going to burn out, blah, 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 assuming some good pattern of training. But the reality is you're going to specifically adapt to those items. So when we start thinking about this relationship, this purposeful intersection between time and intensity, the earliest way to kind of think about it is to think about this linear intersection idea. So we have time, right, and intensity. And as time goes out, or we want to raise both time and intensity in our capability, right? We want to be able to produce more power for longer. And this is the end desired goal of what we want to achieve in training. More power over longer amounts of time. Don't get me wrong, sometimes we'll just take more power and sometimes we'll take more time. But at the end of the day, we want both. We're greedy. And when we think about training zones, there's simply intersection points on these continuum, right? This desired adaptation continuum. But a lot of you might be looking at that right now being like, well, Tim, I guess you're right. I get it. That's the desired outcome, but that's not how I get there. As a matter of fact, if I look at that and I think about training and doing intervals or time and intensity bouts, right? It really looks more like this. It's an inverse relationship to our desired goal. And I want everybody to think about that for a moment, because I actually think it's more important than you might think in the first blush. You're attempting to achieve this, more power over more time. And I could have made that power, but you're trying to achieve more power over time. When in reality, the training that's required to achieve that has the inverse relationship to your desire, because that's kind of what you end up doing with intervals, right? You're taking a goal of more power over time and you're breaking it into chunks that you can achieve to help raise yourself towards that end adaptation. So when we start thinking about the training required, using those training zones as training mechanisms, right, and driving us towards this end goal, we have this inverse relationship. But the thing is, the other misconception here, and it's not really a misconception, but it's more of a misconception than you realize, and again, I'm going to explain why, is we think it's linear. It's not a linear relationship. Actually, the nature of the time and intensity relationship, when we think about the human performance or the human power duration capabilities, it's sigmoidal. And it's more shaped like this when we blow it up more in a logarithmic kind of view. It's easier to see this way, but it's still sigmoidal. And now this starts to look familiar, does it not? This really becomes the linear approach towards training zones would look like this. There's one size fits all. But as we continue to evolve this idea, we have to move away from that linear line and move to a more sigmoidal approach. That is why we developed the power duration curve, because we wanted to evolve. Well, we had a bunch of reasons, but one was to evolve training zones. So the reality is you start thinking about this, the end goal was more power over time. And again, you'll take more power, you'll take same power longer, but the goal is you want both. The training application of zones is an inverse relationship of that. And as we individualize that or look at it at the real human level, like N of one human, each one of us, that shape more looks like this. And training zones right now in the world today are either based on this or based on this. And that really is the basis that we have for zones. Now, as we began to understand this relationship, this human performance relationship, we could better apply this idea that training, and more on an individualized basis, and again, I'll go deeper on that, I'll stop. And the reality is we realized there were certain spheres of influence. Training in this area might raise one energy system, or might help us adapt one energy system. I shouldn't say raise it, improve. How's that a better answer? Training in this area might be another, and training in this area might yet be another. And we also realized when we completed training at some of these key points of intersection, right? We found specific performance demand responses. Now, in a lot of ways, that's a direct relationship. I want to get faster at 10 minutes. I got to do 10 minutes. But in a lot of other ways, it's not. If you're doing something that's generally anaerobic, you might have a need in your race events to climb a 2-minute hill really hard. But you actually might find, as you individualize your training, blending physiology and individualization of the power duration curve, that 90 seconds is a better training target for you, will bring you better results. And that's as you move from a linear to a sigmoidal or curve-based targeting platform. And of course, the reality is these two would be complementary to each other. They would work together. That basically is the basis of all training zones. Meaning if you go back and you look at, I don't care what you base the training zones on. I love using this kind of basic chart because this really is just based on effort. There's no power number, there's no heart rate number. There's just, oh, here's some effort and here's some basic things that it will do for you. And these are, even in the most fundamental formats, physiological and specific demands. So even you look at their hard maximum, right? Improved performance capacity. That's a really cool way to say it. You could say anaerobic, right? And anaerobic energy, but they're relating it to performance capacity because it could be different sports. But again, even on top of that, speed, sprinting, maximum efforts, develops maximum performance and speed. So it's interesting how you can take this theory of what I was just showing you through the human performance curve, whether you use a linear or a sigmoidal curve basis, and you could break these things down into zones. But to understand that, in reality, you need to understand the basis. So let's go a little deeper on the basis. And I see two questions. I'm going to come up to both of them. One, so let's go back into this idea. I'm sorry, I was reading questions there. The basis of training zones. So what's the goal of designing training zones or levels? Now notice I switched languaging here. And I'm going to take this moment when Dr. Coggin, and even people before that, but when Dr. Coggin developed power levels, he didn't want to call them zones, he called them levels. And I know you've heard this argument, maybe you haven't. And the theory was levels because they were descriptive. He was looking at what people were doing, where those influences were happening on the curve, and said, yeah, this is kind of where it comes out. If they go out and do a hard interval, they're going to come out in this kind of level, and that probably means they're improving their anaerobic capability or their aerobic capability or whatever that might be. So he named them levels. So I'm going to call them levels for a couple of seconds. I'm going to go back to zones as things evolve, and you'll see why. So we just simply needed to do a better job to describe the intensity work levels. So we wanted to start, and all the people, when you look at all training zones, they all do a pretty good job of understanding and basing themselves in the three-zone system, the three-zone system, which is divided by two thresholds. Now, I'm going to absolutely avoid the arguments of thresholds and naming nomenclature. I think this does it pretty well, gives you an understanding of the groups of different names, but I'm just going to call them right now first threshold and second threshold. And second threshold in our system is typically your FTP, or your functional threshold power, or your threshold heart rate, right? So in that range is your second threshold. And then you have this green, yellow, red zones, which green is easy and very aerobic. red is hard is anaerobic, and zone 2 is what's in between your first threshold and your second threshold and is a combination of both, right? I'm keeping it simple, staying out of the physiology for the moment. So in reality, though, I hate this model because it actually leads to a lot of newer coach confusion or people getting into um, self-coaching now. And I actually think is part of what I'm going to call the precision problem downstream. So I'm going to change that and I'm going to make it look like this for the rest of my presentation. And here's why. Even though I'm lousy at color coding and making this work, I wish this was a little more yellow. But one, it's transitionary. All systems are always producing energy at the same time. It's not like, wow, I flipped over to one system to the next system. I went 1 watt harder and now I'm doing something totally different. It's a transitionary range of power. And two, and I want everybody to understand this point, if I could go back and do any one thing in WKO different, I would take functional threshold power and change it from a number to a range, a sort of tight range, but I would put a range on it and not be as specific as it's become. Because the reality is when we start thinking about this first threshold and the second threshold, it's not a specific number. It's a pretty tight range around that. And the range around your LT or your second threshold or your LT2 or your FTP is tighter than around your LT1. Your LT2 is easier to find in all types of testing format and functional testing protocols pick it up well. LT1 is very hard to find because even in a lab, we think we go to a lab, oh, we got our LT1 nailed. Go do an LT1 test 5 days in a row. And I guarantee you, you'll get at least 4 different numbers. Now, hopefully close and you can round in there, right? But you'll get different numbers. That's why you have to treat these as a range. So I don't like thinking like my threshold is 300 watts. I'd rather say my threshold is 295 to 305. And know that in that zone, that's that kind of gray zone of threshold setting, whether that applies to zone targeting or TSS or whatever, those are still generalizations and you want to avoid that over specificity. Okay, so we start with this, right? And this was the 3-zone model with a better understanding of transitions. And that's an excellent model. I mean, it's great. It has physiology. We know working in each one of those zones has an influence on each one of those metabolic systems or metabolic or energy systems or the way we produce energy. But in reality, it lacks the granularity for good coaching or self-coaching. We couldn't really deliver the said principle in just 3 zones. Because what kept happening is people would say high zone 1, medium zone 1, medium zone 2, high zone 3, low zone 3, right? So what were you doing right off the bat is you were cutting up your 3-zone system to really achieve your said principle targeting. And here's where it gets interesting, right? These 3 core zones in the background were based on years of physiological experience and understanding in labs and understanding human physiology. As we began to make training zones, so now I'm going back to zones, as we began to make these training zones, and whether you're doing this with heart rate or power, they were based on observation, empirical data, and some quantitative information. I think everybody thinks that there was this huge lab and there was 1,000 cyclists all hooked up to one big brain. You know, it was some form of the matrix, right? And we crunched all that big brain number and everybody was doing exercise and we came up with these numbers. Actually, in a very smart way, and I'll just talk about what I know about what Dr. Coggin did, what Andy did in his first as he set power. He was watching coaches compare heart rate to power. And he knew, because he's a pretty smart guy, that that's kind of backwards. He said, you know what, we just need a system of power that was based off something that could work. So he, through working with others and the wattage group and Hunter and all kinds of people at the time, Alan Lim and Dean Golich and all that gang, began to say, okay, if we take something like functional threshold power, then we can begin to use observation of a lot of data, empirical data, and using some quantitative points and take a look at it. but they needed to start with an anchor point. So Andy said, look, we can determine that LT2 by actual functioning performance pretty well. So let's devise a functional threshold power number and then base a zone-based system off of that. So a system first gets an anchor point. And with the data we had back then, that anchor point was best determined by FTP. Then we said, okay, let's start manipulating that anchor point and say, what is sprint and speed performance? What is max, right? Well, looking at all the data, everything over 150%. And then they said, okay, well, what's everything that's too easy? Like just active recovery, you're only spinning to get. And after they looked at a bunch of data, they came up with, well, let's do the minimum of 55%. I think that's a good number. And then eventually they said, what about endurance? And we got a number, 56 to 75%. And they said, what about supra threshold, but anaerobically charged? Oh, let's get 121 to 150 for that one. And I think you get the point. And over time, this empirical range of data driven, the foundation being the 3-zone model of physiology, driven by the need of a higher granularity and specificity, we designed power training zones. Now, that was the same process we go through heart rate. And I want everybody to understand that, because when you look at such precision, I think precision is really becoming a dangerous enemy right now. I'm going to show you why. When you look at such precision at times, these weren't even determined with the level of precision you might think. Now, that being said, I think Coggin was genius on this. He nailed and got these really right at a time when all this data was new and things were emerging here in this field. And for him to have come up with the original classic training zones and had been able to time bound them well based on the information we had was awesome. We've just evolved a little bit more. But yet I will still tell you, by far, this is by far the most used, this and his heart rate training zone and Joe Friel's heart rate training zones are some of the most used. Like 70% of the world is still using that, maybe even 80. And I might just be making that number up. I know it's pretty high, but it's pretty big. And the reality is he did a great job on that based on physiological information, but quantitative and empirical on top of that. The problem is, in reality, right, that is the representation of this system because it's based on a single anchor point. And it is just a reverse linear look at intensity and time relationship. You can see it even in the time ranges. You can see it in the percentages, all connect, neat, and clean, as do the time ranges, right? And it was just a simple way of putting a linear relationship to the time and intensity of training bouts, whether that's an interval or an hour or whatever you're doing, so that you could put them somewhere on this linear equation based off that anchor point and make them work. Well, and then just jumping ahead a little bit, when we did WKO4, we knew that was a problem, right? And now it's much more common to see individualized levels, but I would honestly say WKO4 was the first software, or the first group, the first thinkers to kind of tackle the idea that we needed a better approach, more individualized for individual folks. And the way we had to do that is we needed a lot of anchor points. We didn't need just one. One left too much interpretation in training levels and training zones for athletes and coaches. We needed multiple anchor points. And the power duration curve, I can only speak for ours, has 5. I could have put one more anchor there, right? Some of the other systems I'm going to talk about might have 2. One, I don't know how many anchor points it has. So the reality is you need more than one anchor point. Too many anchor points and it won't be right. Too few anchor points, it won't be right either, but that's math question for another day. And the power duration curve was created based off this principle. And off of that, we developed this idea of I levels, which are granularity, right? They're still based on physiological principles, but they're based on your individual power duration curve. That's why the power duration curve does not predict like a critical power curve. It does not predict what you can do. It's estimating what you are doing, what you have done, and what you can do. It's smoothing, it's fitting the power duration relationship of the athlete, so we can get quality things like training levels out of that. So I would honestly say right now in levels, for athletes using classic levels, you're leaving some percentage of performance, 3%, 5% improvement. I don't know. It depends on how you apply the whole system and training and everything else, by not individualizing your training, because it can be significantly wrong. And there's a webinar I've done out there. I've done it like 2 or 3 times, individualizing your training. Watch it. It explains it well. Now, I think both roles, I use both levels. So I'm answering a question right now. I'll use classic levels in the winter when I'm not really tuned in. Like, it's okay, we're just riding, we're getting there, we're doing some general intervals. But once I get about 12 weeks out, it depends on the athlete and the event, anywhere between 16 and 8 weeks out, I flip over to everything is individual eye levels. But I'm also going to show you today sort of my secret of how I really do target. I've been asked tons and times how I target, and some of it's going to be more advanced and some of it's going to be a little old school. But once I get anywhere from 16 to 8 weeks out, again, depending on the event, I hone in and I will really begin to focus on eye levels, greater targeting of intensity. Think about it. When you're doing your kind of base training, to use classic periodization terms, go back to my point of over precision, right? You don't need to be overly precise. The mental energy to be this precise isn't worthwhile in in your base training. It is, as you now get into your peak and you're moving towards peak performance, that precision is worthwhile. Now, if you think about these general training zones, the COG and classic levels, Friel's levels, and there are numerous systems based on the same empirical approach. Now, in power training, all of them are based on some version of threshold, most of them based on FTP. In heart rate training, you have some based on max, some based on heart rate reserve, and probably a higher bulk of them based on threshold heart rate. So you have all different systems, but the reality is they're based on a single marker of threshold, of one of the thresholds, and the reality is they're fixed to that. Now, there's been more individualized approaches, like obviously we have eye levels and optimized intervals, and I'm going to be a proponent of those. Inside, which I typoed, no offense, Inside. I think Inside's a pretty solid program, you guys. I've seen back and forth in this discussion. I don't use it enough to honestly know, but it looks like they're doing a pretty good job. I actually think it's complementary with what WKO is teaching you. I should think about integration more at some point, but the reality is, and I apologize about the typo, and Exert is another one out there using models. Sufferfest has its 4 ADP or whatever. So there are different groups that have figured out that training levels need to be more individualized. And I think if you ask me, one of the big evolutions I'd love to see in the next 5 years is this become a bigger and bigger deal. Whether it's eye levels or what we're doing, but people understand the importance of individualization. So now, in reality, let's talk about demystifying. I sort of said demythifying. And the reality is I want to talk, and I'm going to go into the opinion zone here. So please feel free to ask questions, push back. I'll gladly engage with it. I just wanted to give a basis of where training zones came from and what they were used and how they came about, what they are. But let's talk about this. And here's the question I wanted to answer. One of the things I wanted to try to do with webinars, even though I'm not sure it's the right approach, is to try to answer questions that I frequently get online or through our communication processes. And one of the things I see is there's a current trend in endurance training, whether you're coach or self-coached or whatever, that I think is really actually potentially very damaging. And it relates to these training zones. The questions I get are more specifically about targeting. And that's why I wanted to start with training zones, but I want to talk a little bit more about targeting and the impact certain changes in our technology have had on that. Excuse me a second. All right, ready to roll. So when Coggin came up with the original classic training zones, he was very strong on that coaches needed to understand that they were descriptive, not prescriptive. And what he meant by that was he wanted people to go out and say, okay, go do intervals at 4 minutes and do them pretty hard, RPE of this. You can't talk, you can't complete a sentence, whatever your prescription of pretty hard was. Come back, look at the power data and go, oh, okay, that was a VO2 max interval in that system, or that was an anaerobic capacity power in that system, so that you could begin to describe what the athlete was doing in a common language. And that language would directly relate to the desired adaptation and outcome. And that should improve the ability for the coach to analyze athletic training and performance. What quickly happened, like faster than he could put a cap on it, and he would have never stopped it anyway, is people saw the coaches, scientists, I want to use this to analyze, I want it to be descriptive. Coaches quickly saw the benefit of having this description and said, oh, I might as well just prescribe it that way because that's what I want anyway. And that began us down this path of interval bout prescription. So we began to use classic zones. All right, I want you to go out and do VO2 max intervals. That's 105 to 120% of your threshold. Your threshold is 300 watts. So therefore, here's your target. You're going, can't do math fast enough, and the pressure 315 to 360, right? Bam, there's your, I need those intervals. But even that was a pretty big range, but you were targeting within that range. Athlete would go out and do the intervals. Because they're a good athlete, they were listening, they would look to keep them in that range. And you would generally get that as a coach, maybe a little over, maybe a little under, but that's what you would get. But the reality is, we really just wanted a way to describe the intensity work levels. And this rapidly evolved into the prescription zones, which was okay, right? But then what's happening now, and I'm gonna really push on this a little bit, and I hope people watch this part of the webinar all across the internet because it's my strong opinion. Not my science, my strong opinion. But that prescription recently in the last couple of years has evolved from prescription to what I'm going to call precision. And I think in certain ways that can really hurt us. So what does that mean? So if we think about the way, and I just looking through the names here, there's some coaches that have been around for a while. If you look at the prescription, we used to prescribe like this, right? Sorry, I guess I could have made these a little bigger. And you'd kind of write out your intervals and you'd say, okay, go this hard and here's some target. And you'd have more narrative and more information in there. And what's happened in the last couple of years is everything's turned into this structured format. And TrainingPeaks is at part of the lead of that. And so are other companies like Zwift, right? You can build very structured workouts in these two that have a high precision in execution to them. And as a matter of fact, if you go on Zwift and do these in erg mode, you get exact precision, right? And if either of these, you load this to your Garmin or you execute this on Zwift, it still will beep at you and give you and tell you, get back in that range, get back in that range, get back in that range, right? And the reality is it really has been that evolution because we've gone from this written where the athlete had a lot of interpretation to a degree. They would go out and perform their intervals and the coaching role was description and coaching back on how to perform better. Now, the reality is that that has changed so dramatically because this has become this, right? Go out and do these blocks and your end goal is, 311 watts. 311 watts, that's your target. And if you go out 5 watts outside of that, your device is beeping at you. Or if you're in erg mode in Zwift, you can't even achieve 5 watts outside of that. And I think athletes have become very happy with structured workouts. They love them, right? Easy to interpret. I go there, I do my exact 311 watts. I must be getting the best response out there. I did the work and away I go. I go home and I feel very satisfied. And then the reality is we're like, well, Tim, it isn't that controlled. Oh yeah, it is. And I think everybody here would know that, right? And it's like, and particularly with the rise of Zwift and particularly in the challenges we've had this past year plus, right? And how much time we've probably spent on Zwift, we've gotten very addicted to structure. I sell training plans. I sell eye level training plans, which can't be structured because they're eye levels, they change. And people send them back all the time. They return them because they want the structure. And I literally occasionally write people and say, well, I know you want to return this, and I'll give you this classic structured version, but I'm telling you the eye levels is better because it'll be more individual. And they're WKO owners. It's more individualized to you. And they're like, yeah, but I really want the structured workouts and I don't want to have to edit them myself. That's true. It is more convenient. There's always an easier path, right? But if you think about what I just said, you begin to see the problem of this evolution of the precisions and this need for precision, precision, precision. And I don't think it's because driven by the athlete feels it's a better answer. More so, it's a more convenient answer. It's something that simply can be executed with mental and physical ease. My number one requested workout, because it's not in any of my plans, it's not in any of my workout libraries, is, oh, I need a structured FTP test. And I'm like, well, okay, the reality is you can't do the FTP structured. And if I was to give you one, half the world would literally do the FTP test in erg mode. We've gotten so addicted to this structure, to this level of precision, I don't think it's healthy for us. So I want to re-engage. And the reason why I want to talk about training levels again a little more is ask coaches to begin to go back and rethink the paradigm. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a good, bad thing going on here. Structure has been a positive factor in endurance sports, but it just comes with a little bit of a price, right? Some cost. It's actually a good tool for immature or newer athletes. And by immature, I mean they've only just started riding. They don't have a lot of training history. But I've actually begun to believe it's even beyond a potential limiter for mature athletes. And people ask me all the time, do you prescribe intervals and eye levels? Do you prescribe intervals in zone, curve under a curve, optimized intervals and stuff like that? And I always kind of vaguely duck the answer. So I'll be a little more specific today. I use all of them and none of them. I know I'm such a cad here, design all this in WKO, and then I use all of it and I use none of it. Or I use some other old school stuff. So I'm actually going to show you my process. Not that I think you should follow my process, but I want coaches and self-coach athletes to think beyond the precisions. This is the precisions, right? And it took me a lot of time to think about even using the words and how to explain this. And I want to call this the athlete coding approach because I think this is what we're breaking down in our athletes. I see it all the time. Most of you have heard me argue against athletes that don't want to test. I just want to do a ramp test, or I just want to do the critical power 3 and 9 minute test. I hate doing 40 minutes long. I can't do that. If you can't ride 40 minutes really hard, you're never going to race really well. Just got news for you. I don't want athletes who can't test for 40. Now, don't get me wrong. They could have some anxiety and some struggle, but I don't even want to work with you if you can't do that, or if I don't believe you can learn to do that, because you're not going to race well. You're just not going to be mentally tough enough. Sorry if I'm insulting anybody listening to this, but I am 99% right. Some people might break through in a race or whatever, but it is part of the mental game. But also beyond that, right? We got to be careful not to turn athletes into these kind of monotone droning that the precisions bring about. And I think what happens is you need this coding, decoding relationship with an athlete. And I couldn't describe it better, but I think you guys will get a feel for what I mean here. So if you think about this idea that you're prescribing intervals and the athlete, you as the coach, your job is a lot of things, but one is for a workout, right? You're prescribing intervals. Bouts of intensity, right? So intervals. And that's the coach code. But the athlete still needs to decode that. Meaning, you used to say, and we used to do a lot of coaching, like somewhere in that zone 5, 310 to 360, you were expecting and you were coaching, you were teaching your athlete to find their way in that broad zone to executing good workouts. Now, because what happens with Zwift, or they load it to their Garmin and it says do 311 watts or whatever my example was, they stop coding, they stop thinking, they're not decoding, they're not looking for anything except to achieve a number, which turns everything into a pass-fail. It makes it binary in its approach. What I want to get people thinking back about, not doing totally away with structure, but just going beyond this idea, right? That this structure is, and again, it's probably a little small, you can't see that, but I think it says like 220 watts, 222 watts, right, for each one of these intervals. And that's exactly what they're delivering. I want people to go beyond that, because the reality of all this precision, it just kind of results in this reality is that you code it and the athlete just executes the code. They literally stop thinking on the road. And you as a coach, my own coaching experience, I'm blessed to work with some really amazing, talented athletes. And it really is a blessing. And I love to say I made them amazingly talented. That's probably not true. They came that way. But the reality is, part of that is you work through the training and the coaching. Even in these communication and languages, I don't want athletes that just execute the codes. I want ones that decode what I say. So what does that mean? When I write interval training, I look at three things. This is my athlete code. Really, there's a fourth one that this all sits on. So actually there's four. So the reality is I'm looking at history. There is no greater indicator, no model, no nothing else than history of what somebody can do. So I start with history. Then I look at a training level. I'm still not prescribing it as a zone. I'm looking at the relationship between the performance history, and I'm going to actually show some examples of this. Then I review it in the context of level. And when I say level, by the way, I also mean optimized intervals, as I'll show you. Then I look at neuromuscular manipulation. Are we doing something high cadence, low cadence, some other impactors, variables might have been a better word, in the system, right? And here's how it plays out for me. I review history. I check the average. I look at historical performance of similar intervals. I average the numbers. I check the levels. I review the variables. Then I write my code. That's what I do. So right off the bat, when I review history, it's this simple. I'm actually going to show you a little bit of one of my secret charts here in a couple of slides. I'm just looking back, like if I'm prescribing 3-minute intervals, I'm usually prescribing them because it's a good option. It's the good answer. Optimized intervals is suggested. That's a good time. So then I'm looking at the power of their last set of similar intervals. I can see this athlete, and I only grabbed 3, whatever. I'm sure there's more. None of this is even the same athlete. 324, 319, 316. I'm running an average on that. I'm just going to eyeball it right now at 320 watts. Okay, that's my starting prescription. I know I just kind of blew the whole fancy model and optimized, but not really, right? I'm making sure this, then I take that 320 number, I have it in my head. I'm actually going to complete the loop when I'm done. Then I look at, does that fit accurately within the level I'm trying to target? Is my intensity and time close? So I might come back and tweak it. You look at this optimized interval, maybe I add that, I add 15 seconds. Is the targeting in the right range? It isn't always. They might not be maintaining the model, something else might be going on, or I might not be prescribing the right number of bouts. That's kind of like a lost thing, the right number of intervals, right? Sometimes inability or not having the perfect target is a result of inappropriate training frequency or interval frequency. You not have enough of them. So I want to go and review, and you noticed I only had 3 of those here, and look here, and I don't know if this isn't, I don't know who this is or whatever. I should have got a more cohesive example. It's the same athlete. So the reality is that would tell me, wow, they did 3 intervals above that zone. I need to notch it up, not to 4. I need to go 5 next time, maybe even 6, right? So think about what I'm saying. I'm taking history. First, I want to know what the athlete's really done. Let me just lock that in my brain and use that as my starting point. Now I validate it in a training level and optimize it. I use these as validation of history and potentially hints of higher intensity, lower intensity. But whenever I see lower intensity, I usually assume it's not enough frequency. And hopefully that makes sense what I mean by that. If the athlete's overachieving and their model's well retained, it probably means they can do more intervals. I'm not prescribing enough intervals. And that's why you have to kind of do it as this circular package, as this process, whatever, right? So I review history, I check the levels. I'm looking at my 3, I could have used my animation there, right? Then I look at the variables. I also don't prescribe, I have interval athletes that travel all around the world. They're in different altitudes, different locations, different environments. I want to know terrain. I want to know temperature. I want to read the notes about, man, I just got off 36 hours of flying. There's all kinds of variables, but you also can't ignore those in your interval targeting. Now, here's what's funny. I'll jump back some slides. When you get over-structured, when you get into the precisions, right? You don't take into account any of that thinking. As coaching, we're over-relying on the AI at times. We're over-relying on the AI, and we're then giving a very precise prescription. Our code is very mechanical, where I'm taking the best of that mechanical. AI should, remember, models, analytics, they support our decision-making process. They should not be the decision-making process. You've heard me say that 100 times, and you're now watching me literally share how I bring that to life. It helps remove my own biases, right? I should do 1 or 2 more intervals. It helps me make better decisions with the goal of improving the odds. But at the end of the day, I still have to write the code. I write the code. So then, I know I'm soapboxy. You guys can get me later on it. So, right, then my code comes out, this versus this, I'm always a little bit of both, right? And that code has to contain that. So let's go next step, and then I'll bring it all together. Now, my code has to signal certain things for the athlete. How I communicate is going to signal things, because the athlete gets the information and they have to decode it. And I want them to decode it. And they look at my target, they're going to adjust on the fly. I don't mean they're sitting there going, screw him, I'm going to go out and do 20 watts more. I mean, they might. We've all had athletes that'll do that, right? Or I'm not going to do those intervals. But they have to adjust it on the fly. In the process of execution, things go right, things go wrong, things go better, things go worse, right? We have to know and give guidance on the adjustment so they can execute. So let's bring to the decoding part to life, and that hopefully should bring the circle together. What I work to teach my athletes, and the way I do my intervals, is I have a series of different interval processes that I want the athlete to decode. And really there's just 3, so I'm saying a series. So like, this is my classic interval. It's not like I name them, right? Whenever you have to describe one of your own processes, it's like drilling a hole in your head. You're like, oh, how do I name it? Because you don't think in names and communication. But here's my classic, here's my typical one. So I'll tell the athlete, I'll use the history, assuming it aligned, the history, let's say the last 3, remember our last 3 were 320 watts. I would use the history of a similar interval at that watt for the first 1 or 2. And what I mean by that is I want the first interval out of the athlete controlled. Meaning I'll say do 315 to 320, 310 to 320, depends on the athlete. Some athletes are very good. So now notice now I am being precise. I am giving clear guidance, right? I want 310 to 320. Second interval, I want you to increase it by feel. Don't go crazy. And this is where you got to go. You need time and back and forth with the athlete, because a newer athlete goes crazy on the second one, blows themselves up, right? Because they're not thinking, yeah, I'm going to be able to complete all those. Ego writes checks we can't cash. But that's what we do as coaches. It's not training plan writers. We're coaches. And we're saying, hey, athlete X, that second one was a little too hard because we saw too, and that's teaching them. So the second interval, your complete target, right? And then the rest at target. So what I tell the athlete, I want you to hit a target that you feel you can hit and sustain for the rest of the intervals. And then each interval workout, I'm coaching them to get better and better at that, because they might be on the move. That 310 to 320, their fitness might be really on the move, right? And they might be able to go 310 to 320, not blow up on the first one, because that is a common mistake. Sometimes that's not a bad thing too, by the way. That's one of my 3 systems called max, but very rarely using max, but it is very effective when you use it right. But here you have a controlled interval. You send the code. Hey, athlete, here's the code. They have to decode it on the second interval and then decode the rest of the workout. And I think that is part of it. And then finally, I have ranges I want the athlete to feel when they complete the interval. empty or exhausted, depleted, or ready for another. And when I ask an athlete, like, how did you feel at the end of that? I want them to use that kind of verbiage. I was totally exhausted. I had to lay on the side of the road for a little while and look up at the sky. Okay. You don't want too much of that, but sometimes that's interval workout, right? Depleted. I was really tired. I really didn't want to do another one. I was out of energy, but I was able to ride home and do the work. I could have done another one or two. So part of my targeting, I put this communication in the verbiage. So I'll still use structure. And if you can see this one's a little lower than this one. But I also always use range, and I tell my athlete that this is guidance only. And that's hard for athletes because then they still load it up to their Garmin. They see 311 on their Garmin and they try to do 311. So I do my intervals that way. I'll try to set the first one a little down and then bam, 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 bam. So that is one decoding mechanism. So that's my classic. Sometimes I have a hard, right? So hard, and then max is way up here, but I'm not going to show max because it's actually in one of my webinars somewhere. So I want the first interval controlled. So many times I want you to control that first interval because that's the interval you can set the tone and blow yourself up on. Remember, that's in a training level. How does this result? Now you're doing training zones. And I want to make sure that that athlete delivers my expectation. It's in the zone that I wanted. I know it's in the zone that I wanted, that I wrote it. But now by the second one, I want best effort. I want them to go near max hard. I don't care if they crap out by the end. I mean, I don't want them to, and I'm trying to target it correctly, but I want them to push now. And if you look closely, the way these are controlled, high, slightly lower, slightly lower, slightly lower, slightly lower. I literally give the athlete permission to go harder here. I want these to be really hard, and I want them to exceed it. I don't want them actually to even read the structure, to be honest with you. I want them to go near max. I tell them decline in interval power is okay, and I want them to finish on empty. So if you understand what I'm doing, I'm trying to take this idea, when I look at all the training levels, training zones that I get, and all the questions, it's at this interpretation point, this coding and decoding, that the theory breaks down. Because we have certain assumptions of precision is better. Precision is not better. It's not. Being precise is having good controls and using all of this amazing analytic and AI to help make better decisions. That's better. But at the end of the day, that athlete puts on some spandex, pulls on some shoes, and goes out and does the intervals to what they can and cannot do. And what's funny is when we're doing that on Zwift and we're running erg mode, you always kind of complete erg mode workouts because it never pushes you. You never go beyond, right? I mean, I shouldn't say always. We can all fail and fatigue out, right? And the reality is somehow we get that done. But that's decode. I mean, that's the athlete shutting off coding. And that's the athlete underachieving 3 to 5 times, my opinion. Beginning to go back to this idea, we have all this analytics, we have this data. Then when these are done, did they do it how I want it? Did they get the decoding? And then I coach them up to understand it again and go out and do a better interval set. Coaching is a human element, one-to-one. And it can't be replaced by self-coaching. Sorry, self-coaches, because that's what a great coach does. Anybody can target a zone. Coaching gets the most by teaching the athlete how to do those intervals amazingly well, how to best prepare for the bouts, how to deliver 5 more watts when they need to take their performance beyond. That's what it's all about. And this slide was supposed to be up above, slightly out of order. My point is when the numbers are under, sometimes like if an athlete can overachieve all those numbers, but your model is robust, you need more intervals, more frequency of interval. Sorry, that's out of order. Now, once the athlete does the workout, what do I do to take a tracking look? I have a pretty simple process. And Richard, I've seen your question the whole time. I'm actually going to get to it shortly. And I only have 2 or 3 slides left. So if you guys have questions, feel free to ask. So the first thing I do, and this is a common time and zone, it's in the regular view or advanced view, workout view. The first thing I do in a workout is I drag a selection and I make an a range throughout all the intervals. And this is not the same workout, as you could probably tell, but I drag, or maybe it is, just there was more of them. I think it is because it's the same athlete, I think. So I drag an interval over that range. And now if you notice, I'm only looking at the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 intervals being completed. And I'm looking quickly. I love color coding. Visually, you can see the yellow. This athlete was a little surgy, but we can also see some heavy terrain. Actually, what they're doing, you can see they're coasting down the hill here. They get to the bottom. They start riding back up here. So there must be a little false bottom. And then they go, and there's a little terrain mix. But you can quickly see they held back. Here's your controlled first one, more yellow. Second one, they go a little harder. Realize, hey, I still got a little more. Third one, harder. Fourth one, harder. Fifth one, a little bit of mental suffering here. Sixth one, all right, now I'm tired. I'm slowing down. So you get a ton just at a simple heat map review. Just grab that range, make it a selection, zoom right in on it, and there it is. Then in that selection, and this is in the same dashboard, I did 2 separate charts, but it's in the same dashboard. I look at the time and eye level cycling. I don't ever review. Earlier, I said, I'll target without, I first target by history and then use eye levels. In my review, it's all about eye levels. So here I'm looking at visual time in recovery and time in the FTP FRC zone, which should have been orange, which was the targeting, but I see a little yellow there. So they probably did that first one a little too light, but I'm cool with that in the first one. And then they kind of got some fatigue. I also know from the yellow here, yellow N, that that's probably the right amount of intervals too. So visually, I can see right time in zones, and I can see that they were 44% recovery, 42% on. That's a pretty good mix, 1-to-1 ratio. 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, it looks like these are. Or is it 3 minutes? But you get the point. The ratio was 1-to-1, and they delivered 1-to-1. We get a lot of deep analysis going, and I'll go deep when it's situational, when it's necessary. Something goes wrong, I want to find out why. Something goes really right, I want to find out why. But in everyday observation, I start here. I have a very simple interval review that I do, but I have a different chart for each level of intervals. They all match a different time and zone interval. And all I'm looking at is the duration, the power, the time above 90 or 95%, depends what range of intervals I'm looking at. I have a rule, which I'm just kind of keeping to myself, and then I'm looking at time and zone of the interval, which I'm kind of seeing here visually, right? But I could actually read it up here. But in reality, I just want to look at time and zone in the interval. So here, the athlete time and zone was 224, but really to get to the VO2 max power, because remember, power at VO2 max is based off the VO2 max, which is part of the power duration curve, but it's not a training level. It's your true VO2 max. That wasn't quite enough. So here goes a little harder. I'm not really, and I'm saying me, but whoever this is, really only achieved a small amount more. They really didn't go that much harder on the second one. You can see that in the power, and they're just, these intervals, this is a good warm up. They could have went a little punch harder on that second one. I don't think these are the same workouts now that I look at them. This third one, all right, and the fourth one, now they're starting to really accumulate some good time and zone that's paying off. Now they're going harder. And a lot of times when you look at this chart and then go back and look at the color coding, more isn't always more. It's not like, wow, some area was higher or something, I could make this interval 350 watts by taking 30 seconds in the middle and going 500 watts, right? So the reality is that's why I'm always looking at these two in combo. I do believe that VO2 max is, when it comes to my comparative numbers, because the other element I have that I'll look at workouts, but I do this as slightly big picture, is time at and above threshold. So VO2 max is your greatest indicator of your cardiovascular fitness. Threshold, FTP, is the greatest indicator of your metabolic fitness. Managing those two together so that they empower each other is very important in training, because obviously those are the two of the three major contributors to performance. Neuromuscular strength, to keep it simple, and neuromuscular, we tend to just think muscle, but we're talking about brain and the neurological event. I'm lumping that all into one thing. all working together, that's what creates elite athlete performance. But from a pure training sense in this code, in this view, I'm looking at that combination of cardiovascular stress and strain. Here, I would call this cardiovascular strain and metabolic stress on the system. And that's what I'm looking at in the average. So I come back and review that. Then I run a calculator. I really do. It's kind of sad, and I know this is going to bring about people who are going to say, well, we need a way to total those up in WKO. It's not as easy as it sounds because of the way WKO is structured to allow all these crazy analytics. But I just basically run a number and say, okay, the average of that is 317 watts. The next time I prescribe similar intervals, that's interval 1. But only if it fits within the zones and makes sense with optimized intervals. So you understand it's a big cycle over time, because that big cycling, guys, that's coaching. And that's the difference maker of how you take a system, a scheme. Remember, that's how I defined a scheme of application and communication. That's what it is in its total sense. But instead of just applying that as a scheme, instead of just making the precisions the answer, we're using it as a coach or a self-coached athlete to improve our thinking and our decision-making process, to improve our ability to execute intervals, then come back and make sure, because what I'm looking at here, were these in the right zone? Yes, most of the time I was in the right zone. So we go back to the physiological adaptation that I expect. I did the work I needed to do. I can look at that from a physiological sense in 2 ways: the actual time and zone, the stress. And I can look at the time at some percentage of VO2 max, which will also give me deeper insight. I have 3 or 4 others that I keep in my simple review chart. And you could probably start thinking of your own, thinking about the way that I've just said it. Okay, so now Q&A. Sorry, there's just no possible way I can do a webinar in under an hour. Humanly not possible. So I have one question that I didn't fully answer, so I'm going to start with that. If you have questions, ask them now. I don't care. Whatever your questions are, throw them over the fence and I'll see if I can answer them. The question I have now is, let me just move this over here to my other screen. Can you explain the relationship between VO2 max and eye level? I've heard people say that they're training at a power corresponding to VO2 max. How do you make that determination? Well, Richard, I just gave you the answer. It's in hindsight. So if you know your power at VO2 max, there are systems, targeting systems, that use power, a percentage of power at VO2 max. As a matter of fact, if you looked at the physiological chart I had on the screen way back up here, nobody look at the screen, I'm epilepsy. Up here, it actually tells you, like zone 1 has a bottom. That's about 50% of your power at VO2 max. Way up here, up top, is 100% of VO2 max at the top of that zone. You can actually go over 100% of VO2 max in a short amount of time. So the reality is VO2 max is one of those systems, but that's a very individualized answer, and it really depends on who's targeting system. But I will tell you, if you're using a targeting system based off just power at VO2 max, again, it goes back, it's a linear system because it's only anchored to one point. So again, and that's not bad guidance, you guys. I use classic zones in the winter. But when it comes time to get down to business and be precise, you need individualized systems, whether it's ours or somebody else's. You definitely need it. It's a superior answer. And I've given you the process with the execute. I do spend a fair amount of time. I'm always analyzing time at VO2 max right alongside with time and zone and time at and above FTP. Again, why? Because you're from data analytics, VO2 max is the best indicator of cardiovascular fitness. Threshold FTP is the best indicator of metabolic fitness. Managing those two together and improving both are 2 of the 3 legs of elite athletic performance. All right, cool. I think I've answered everybody's questions. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. I'll put up the recorded version soon. Good night, everybody.